Hey Spuds, how's it going? I hope you're well. It's Jamie. Welcome back to another video. Thank you for clicking on this video. I hope you enjoy it. It's about quite a heavy topic, but we're still gonna make it fun. I don't know. Today's video is about detransitioning. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to have a conversation about the topic of detransitioning, how it's portrayed, how some detransitioners are portrayed. Detransitioning is something that is widely avoided as a topic amongst the trans community. Not many people talk about it. I think it's starting to become more talked about now, but it's kind of historically always been avoided because of how much detransitioning and people who detransition are weaponized against the trans community and used as a way to invalidate trans people. It's rubbish. And sometimes it's even the people who have detransitioned themselves that are now advocating against trans people. Firstly, I want to start off by saying that the current rate of detransition / regret, whatever you want to call it, although they're slightly different and they mean slightly different things, and we're going to get into that in a minute, but the current detransition rate is well under 1%. One study that had a very large sample size and is very recently, it was done last year, found a 0.47 detransition rate, and another earlier study found a 0.6% detransition rate. Those rates are very low, and to visually show just how tiny that number is, I wanted to make a little visual thing for you. So here that is, ta-da! Basically, the shaded ones are all the people that could potentially detransition, and all the non-shaded ones are the people that are happier and their lives have been improved by transitioning, because that's something that has also been found. Transitioning saves lives and it improves lives for the people that it's right for, which is a majority of people who go through with it, as we have just seen from the detransition rates. So alongside these very, very tiny numbers of detransitioners, we also need to deep dive into why people detransition, because it's not just because they're not trans. It's actually been found that the so-called regret rate may not actually be a regret rate at all, but it's better to refer to it as a detransition rate, because most people who detransition have been found to do so because of a hostile environment towards them being trans. So they're not actually regretting it, it's just something they can't do right now because of the environment they're in. Basically, if society wasn't so shitty towards trans people, we would see that detransition rate drop even lower, seeing as a hostile environment is the #1 reason why people detransition. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that within that detransition rate, there is a portion of people who detransition because they're not trans and transitioning was the wrong thing for them to do. Important thing to say is these people were never trans in the first place. And I think a common misconception people get over the fact that some people detransition because it was the wrong thing for them to do is it means that anybody, and maybe all trans people, could suddenly stop being trans. You don't stop being trans, it's just that obviously some people who transitioned, very, very tiny amount, were obviously never trans in the first place. I genuinely have nothing against people who detransition. I don't think that they're bad people or anything. I think that they deserve support. It must be a very tough thing to go through and to experience. So I definitely think it's something that should be talked about quite openly, but in the context of support for those who detransition. Not in the context of, oh, this means that nobody's actually trans and all the people who are saying they're trans and are transitioning now will eventually detransition one day like this person, because that's not what it means. We should support detransitioners without using it to invalidate trans people. And the media has a big part to play in this narrative over demonizing the trans community because of detransitioners, and it often comes out of using the voice of one person who's detransitioned and extrapolating it up and being hundreds of teenagers regret transitioning, and just using numbers that they've been given by an unreliable source or they've plucked out to make it sound scary, but not actually stating any facts or any scientific findings over detransitioning or even into transitioning and all of that stuff. And out of context, a newspaper article that's hundreds of trans teens or hundreds of trans people are now regretting and detransitioning to their original sex and all of this weird headlines they use. Out of context, and for people who don't know about the trans community or very much about it, it sounds scary and it sounds like a big number, because it's oh my god, hundreds of people. You could say hundreds of people for anything. Hundreds of people where those hundreds of people is 0.5% is really tiny. If you put it in the context of percentages and in comparison to numbers of people who don't detransition and don't regret it, it seems very small. If we stopped doing anything or stopped people doing anything or having access to anything that had a 0.47% regret rate or chance of regret, nobody would ever do anything. So the media do their job at creating more fear over the trans community, and particularly kids transitioning or like having access to treatment for being trans. But a lot of these stories come from individuals who've detransitioned themselves and have now turned around and use their experience as a way to attack the trans community and blame the NHS. It's kind of sad to see, because it is like, just because one person or a handful of people had a bad experience, did something that wasn't right for them, and are now struggling with the consequences, it doesn't mean that an entire community is going to have that experience, and it doesn't mean that an entire community has to pay the price. Quite recently there's been somebody who's come out and said they're a detransitioner, they transitioned to male and now they transitioned back to female and they're living as female, and they're literally suing the NHS. They are suing an already painfully underfunded institution. I have sympathy for what they're going through and their experience, but it makes me very frustrated that somebody's turning that around and being like, well, hey, it didn't work out for me and it was wrong, and so therefore I don't think anybody should get access, or I think access for everybody should be really, really difficult. Because, you know, they either want to make treatment impossible for certain age groups or treatment much harder for trans people. And let me tell you, it's already difficult enough. If you are going to a gender clinic in the UK, you don't just show up after like a couple weeks of waiting for an appointment, say, I'm trans, and get given hormones and put on a wait list for surgery. It does not work like that at all. There are very long wait lists. There are multiple lengthy in-depth assessments. I have had many myself, and they're not just casual conversations. These are like proper deep dives into your personal life, your history, your behavior, your family, your life situation, work, friends, school, and it's very deep, very personal, and you have assessments by more than one doctor, and you get asked the same questions, and you have time in between to live as your gender that you're identifying as. And so, you know, it's a process, like it's a process and a half. Because of the way gender dysphoria and being trans is diagnosed by a doctor and you receive treatment for it, it's not something that is determined through a blood test. It's something that is determined through assessments and you reporting how you are feeling, and doctors taking what you are telling them and using that as a diagnosis. The things like depression and anxiety are diagnosed in similar ways. So the doctors and the specialists you're seeing can only go based on what you're telling them. And so I'm really sorry this happened to somebody, but to turn it around and blame the NHS and go so far as to want to sue the NHS and restrict treatment for other people, I think that's very extreme, and I do not agree with that whatsoever, especially given how incredibly rare detransitioning is. Even though headlines are saying hundreds of people can be 0.47%, but then think about how many thousands of people where transitioning has worked, saved their lives, and made them significantly happier. There are quite a few other stories of people who have detransitioned and are now saying that transitioning is child abuse, and just assuming that every trans person will eventually regret it and all of this stuff. There are plenty of people who have detransitioned who are not like that, so I'm not trying to like paint all detransitioners as like bad people or whatsoever. I think it's a small portion, but they are the people who are being reported about and given a platform at the minute. It's not right. Talk about detransition, but don't talk about it in a context where you're then invalidating trans people. So yeah, that's my video on detransitioning. I just wanted to like throw out a video that was kind of some facts, figures, and my perspective on the whole detransition like debate and discussion and all of that stuff. People who detransition shouldn't be shamed, but trans people shouldn't be assumed to be future detransitioners, if that makes sense. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and it was informative and you could learn some stuff and some facts and everything. If you like to think about giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you want to, but no pressure. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.